Welcome. Thank you for being here on the fifth day of an international conference titled Bibliographic Control in the Digital Ecosystem. I am Maria Chiara Iorio from the National Central Library of Florence, and I have the pleasure of chairing the last day of the conference. Today, we continue to explore the changing bibliographic universe and the issues of bibliographic control with 6 special guests. The main frame of the day will be mostly how work is changing for the national bibliographic agencies. Then we'll have the final remarks of the whole conference by some notable speakers. Today's section is full like the others. I remember that the maximum duration for each topic is only 30 minutes. I hope you are comfortable and enjoy the conference. Our first speaker of the day is the head of metadata in the British Library. He is a member of many international library working groups I could say a lot about his accomplishments, but I would rather let him introduce himself more. Today, he will be sharing with us the latest news about the International Standard Name Identifier, or ISNI, and its developments. He is a master of the subject as he was a member of the ISO committee, which was responsible for drafting the ISNI, and has served on the governing board of the ISNI International Agency since 2010. His speech is titled The International Standard Name Identifier, Extending Identity Management through the Global Metadata Supply Chain. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Andrew McKeon. Please, Andrew McKeon.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at your conference. I hope you'll find what I have to say and share with you interesting. So I hope everyone can hear me well enough.
Yes.
Right, I will get going then. So what I wanted to talk about is largely focused on an update on what things are happening with the let me go back. The International Standard Name Identifier. I will preliminary remarks about metadata, data silos and the supply chain. Then I'll say a little bit more about ISNI's place in the supply chain and give a bit of update of some examples of ISNI adoption outside the library, what I call the library data silo, which follows on from the remarks I want to start with. But the main focus I want to talk about and share with you today is really looking at the British Library's work with ISNI and where we're currently getting to with our work around legal deposit, the British National Bibliography and the UK publishing supply chain. So focusing just on one specific area. So I've got quite a few slides to get through, so I will get on. So I was thinking about the metadata silos, and when we first got involved in ISNI, one of the things we were looking at was silos and different areas of metadata being produced in different industries. And this is really just a slide to show you some examples of different identifiers that are proprietary to different data silos. So text publishing uses a number of things in the supply chain before things even get to us in libraries. Music publishing has its own standards and identifiers. AV and film publishing the same, and libraries we're all familiar with our different standards, but we have a separate silo with archives, which has been talked about in other papers in this conference, and that itself is a challenge for many of our institutions where we're operating with both traditional library data and archival data. So my point is there are many silos, there are some crosswalks, and we know that we use, I think it was covered in the ANF talk about their PID, persistent identifier policy and engagement with identifiers. Many identifiers that come to us from the supply chain, from different repertoires, are actually critical in our own automated workflows. So many things are already there. But there's also a lot of rework of metadata. There's lots of things where things don't quite fit for libraries. But my contention is that there's increasing recognition for having high quality data end to end of supply chains. And this is being recognized in a number of places. I think all of the standards I just talked about on the previous slide, people are starting to talk more seriously about we have to get this quality right, and if you get it right at the beginning, it's more useful to you. But people are also talking about across the supply chains, and that's where I'd like to focus on ISNI further on in this talk, because where it's appropriate, some identifiers and some pieces of metadata are common across any repertoire or area of activity and creation. I've listed here just a few examples, and I give references in my written version of the paper. But one attempt to sort of do some crosswalks and make sure that metadata was being created in consistent ways between libraries and book industry Onyx metadata was the framework between RD and Onyx that was discussed and written up in 2006, very early in the days of RDA. Other examples are, there was an organization called the Link Content Coalition that wrote up some principles of identification, again with a view to looking at what matters in forming good identification or identifiers and how they're managed and governed, and having some principles around that. A very recent one has come out of the entertainment industry. Movie Labs wrote a white paper in which they broadly review via ORCID and ISNI, and are looking at ISNI seriously as being the identifier that they want to adopt in the movie industry for communications there. And book industry communications in the UK has recently launched its metadata capability directory to try and track and promote and encourage better use of standards and applications of standards. So just some general thoughts of my own on this subject. I think metadata control underpins the business of the global content supply chains. And some of these are content-specific differences between supply chains, but they're also content-neutral commonalities that cut across supply chains. I think there's general recognition. You can go to any of these sites and you'll see aspirations to get good metadata at the beginning of the supply chain so it can be reused and consumed efficiently throughout that supply chain. Good metadata supports automation, interoperability, efficiency, and we've heard various people talk about ways of doing that this week. Different stages of the supply chain add value according to business need. But my question is, and I really want to use the rest of this presentation and the focus on it to say, can I show this as an example where metadata actually can be created that supports e-commerce, but it also frees up library resource and expertise to focus on enhanced discovery and curation. So ISNI's place in the supply chain, it's meant to be a content neutral standard. It's meant to cut across different repertoires. So it basically is there to act as a bridge identifier that can link name disambiguation efforts across different data silos. It covers authors, editors, musicians, performers, singers, groups and institutions, musical groups, research institutions, pretty much anything that a library might identify in its authority files. Its governance model is also local and global. So it's a network of registration agencies that can specialize across multiple sectors. So they can be publishers, they can be music providers, they can be libraries, etc. And it's built on contributed data at scale using matching algorithms, but also on human curation. I thought I'd just give a quick example of some of the names of the ISNI membership that work in the music industry. I think broadly from this slide, I would say the likes of Apple, some of the major record labels, YouTube, Spotify, are really set up and have joined ISNI to become consumers of ISNIs and to start to have ISNIs as one of the key identifiers that they want to use in music communications and exchanges. Most of these other organizations, you probably won't have heard of any of these. They're all quite new to me. They're really kind of the smaller scale engine rooms. They're organizations specializing in credit, use of identifiers, getting good metadata associated with music created early in the process. There. One example I've just wanted to highlight, because they've actually recently built a registration system that writes ISNI codes into a digital profile used for crediting music creators. I'm just going to quote for their own words, because they probably express it better than I can describe it. Sound Credit's ISNI registration system is part of its largest system for music crediting, using Sound Credit's new massive cloud profile feature. Once music creators and engineers set up a free profile, they can be instantly credited simply by entering an email address, swiping a card at a kiosk, or selecting their profile in an app. Any credited profile in SoundCredit will automatically attribute their ISNI code to every project involving that creator, along with other identifier codes such as IPI, CAE, or IPM that users can optionally enter. So ISNI is already at work, and it's actually starting to appear at the beginning of a supply chain, at the point where music is being engineered and created into sound recordings. Another example from Germany is the VLB, the German books in print for the German-speaking world, who recently became a registration agency, and their intentions are to be able to register, that all publishers listed in the VLB will be able to register new ISNIs for the creators of their works. So I'll start to focus now on the British Library and our case study that I want to share with you. Yes, it was mentioned in the introduction that I have been involved in ISNI from the start. And ourselves at the British Library, alongside the Bibliothèque Nationale, were one of the joint founding members representing the Conference of European National Libraries in the original establishment of a consortium to set up the standard. And along with the BNF, we've been providing quality assurance services for the build and maintenance of the database. And we had a lot to do with the foundational work that used the virtual international authority file, and we worked with OCLC to do algorithms that set thresholds for quality. So although we contain just about everything that was in the virtual authority file, not everything in there got assigned an ISNI. Since then, in the last few years, the British Library, along with many other libraries, has become an ISNI registration agency. And this has given us thought to have a strategic shift away from just thinking about name disambiguation in our catalogues and how do we achieve that through cooperative cataloguing, through shared name authorities, towards thinking more seriously about bridging data silos. How can ISNI help us to do that? How can we think about identity management as being something that's not just about libraries, but it's for the whole supply chain? And what can we do to exploit the potential of the BMB and cataloguing and publication workflows where we have a relationship with the publishing supply chain? We've also looked, and I'll touch on this briefly at the end, developing this new registration service, which we're very close to launching. So our key principles are that we want to embed ISNI into our cataloguing workflows, so make it part of our authority control workflows, automate processes wherever we can, and engage with the supply chain. We have some challenges, and I'm not going to go into depth on all of these, but a big challenge is that embedding ISNI into our authority file, we share an authority file with the Library of Congress and the PCC network. So we're working in collaboration with them on how we take steps to start to populate. But the PCC and the Library of Congress have recently endorsed ISNI as one of the 5 top candidates for being expressed as URIs in name authority records. But how do we get from the ISNIs that we know are associated with those records and start to get them at scale into the LC NACO file? But I won't be talking about that in depth today. That's a challenge that we have to think about. We have some steps in place that we're working on. We also need to get ISNI into our own legacy bibliographic data, and I'll talk about that as part of our case study. And we're building our registration service. But the main thing I want to talk about today is our engagement with the supply chain and how we've kicked it off, because not all supply chains and not all groups are organized enough to start promoting ISNI, know how to adopt it, etc. So we think we need to do some engagement and show people how it can work. So our engagement activities began back in 2018 with a couple of meetings, one hosted by publisher licensing services in the UK, and the other by book industry communications. And both of these focused on how ISNIs can be used both for identifying publishers and imprints and for identifying authors. Crucially, the second meeting included a presentation by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, who at that stage had already begun integrating ISNI into their CIP workflows. So we were grateful for their input in kicking off a dialogue with UK publishers. Since then, we've been hosting a series of follow-up meetings. Every few months, we bring the group back together, we do some work, which I'll be describing, and we're exploring ways for how we can get ISNIs for authors in publishing and trade supply chain metadata. Editorial and bibliographic data services have been key supporters in how we pursue this dialogue, and they've brought on a lot of publishers directly themselves to join in the experiment. This was the initial group. It's been growing since we started, and we've been working with more publishers' data as we've gone along, and I'll show you some results soon. We've kind of parked our use cases and our work on using ISNI to identify publishers and imprints. There's a lot of interest. We've certainly not abandoned it, but we think it's very difficult to do. Publishers and imprints is not something we've traditionally done in our authority files. It's something that is done in the trade to some degree, but in silos within the trade. So the idea of having a crosswalk so that we can better manage identifiers is of interest, but it is a hard thing to get off the ground. So we've looked at supplying authors ISNIs for products in publishers' IDs and matching those ISNIs to the in-house publisher IDs in their own metadata, so they can start to get them into their own product records and export them in Onyx. We looked at formats for exchanging data, and we expected we'd be using Onyx, but actually we've used CSV files because most of the publishers weren't set up for receiving Onyx, they were set up for exporting it. So we started by looking at graph matching because we needed to start off, how do we ourselves, in our own data for British National Bibliography, start to associate ISNIs with authors in the BNB? Well, the key is that we have got NACO name strings and we have correspondences of ISNIs in VIAF clusters and with NACO IDs in them. So using that information, we were able to do some graph matching and build up correspondences across the name strings. And you'll see this in the linked open data version of the BNB, where you'll find ISNIs, VIAF cluster IDs, and NACO strings and IDs. And we've had success at some considerable scale. So we've got over 3 million ISNI correspondences to authors that exist in the back file of the BNB. So with that as our starting point, we were able to invite publishers to submit some of their back files from their own databases of their current and in some cases past authors on their files, but that are still in print. So they have supplied us files and we've replicated that same matching process. Now, this is just one slide. I'm not doing a presentation on how we did this. I'm not the technical expert and the analyst that did this work. But just to give you a flavor of, this took several iterations to go from our results. We had to resolve, and just get this to come up, all kinds of different problems. So a metadata is not as clean as you think it's going to be when you start. And when you're working with publisher metadata and they're not working with authority controlled name strings, it can be fairly difficult and challenging. So we had to develop algorithms that could do some of that heavy lifting work. And we started off with match rates in the sort of 30s and 40%. And through several iterations and refinements, we've managed to improve the quality and the confidence and actually get much better results. This is what we've done. You can see the list of publishers has grown. I think there are 16 on this list. I think we're now up to 18. So there's a couple that I haven't updated this table for. But as you can see, then the majority are in the high 60s or 70s, in some cases higher match rates. So they've supplied us with their authors, and we've managed to get well over 60 to 70% authors assigned with ISNIs. So we've kind of seeded their databases, and I would say at this point we've also seeded their appetite for, well, how do we get more then? Another side benefit of doing this was we managed to achieve some name deduplication. So we've actually shared some of the benefit of name authority control, traditional name authority control, through assigning ISNIs. We've actually done some deduplication between different publishing houses who have works by the same authors, and in some cases within publishing houses. And that's our table of results for some of that. So column 1 is deduplication of IDs across publishers, and column 2 is deduplication of IDs within a publisher. So in a publisher's own records, they've erroneously somehow managed to assign different IDs to the same author. And since this has been going for a while, some of the publishers, and this is an example from HarperCollins, have already begun to reuse the identifiers they've got associated with their author ID, and they're starting to put the ISNI for that author into newly published works. So effectively, it's authority control from the point of publication. So what are we doing next? We have to do further work on improving match rates. We are bringing NACO up to date in ISNI, and in fact, at the moment, we have prepared a file for the back file of 5 years, because since we stopped uploading into VIAF, NACO is not up to date in ISNI, it is 5 years behind. So the British Library prepared a file of NACO records associated with BNB data, title data, and title data from the LC Books All file. And we're submitting that, and that's now with OCLC waiting to be processed. But the enriched data should ensure we get good matching rates. Our goal is to try and bring the coverage for the publishers up to 100% and to have options for how do we assign new ISNIs for them. And some of the options we're looking at is we could do more editorial work for them, but we'd have to probably put a price batch service for that. For new assignments, we're looking at CIP, and we've also developed a service portal. Conscious of the time, so I'll try and speed up for this last slide or two. We've been working, we have our CIP work is contracted out with a company called Bibliographic Data Services. So they're really ready now, once we have an up-to-date reconciliation file of ISNIs and NACO from the last 5 years. We've already supplied them with the first set of reconciliations for the ISNIs already assigned and that were found from VIAF. Once they have that, they will be able to start embedding an ISNI lookup as an automatic thing in their normal CIP workflows, because they're already using lookup NACO, so they will be able to pick correspondences for ISNIs. They're currently considering their own ISNI membership options and looking at the possibility of assigning new ISNIs from scratch where nothing exists in NACO or in ISNI. And we will be discussing feedback loops to publishers in future meetings with the publishers. We have also built a registration portal. This is really because ISNI registration is really, there's a barrier for the fact that you have to be an agency, and it doesn't serve people at a small scale knowing how they can get ISNIs. So we're trying to put something in place that allows authors, very small publishers that can't become ISNI members in their own right because it's just not cost effective, to have access to a simple service to to get ISNI registrations for individuals or organizations. So we can mediate, and we have done for some batch files from people, but individual requests is currently very costly and mostly comes into us via email, and it's not really scalable. So I'll actually go on to a view of the slide. So this is our slide. It's not launched just yet. Will hopefully be launched in the next few weeks. But the basic functions of our portal are search ISNI, because you need to know if you've already got an ISNI. If you haven't got an ISNI, then you are then invited to register for an ISNI. And if you have got an ISNI, you have the option to add data to the ISNI. You can't edit anything in the data because the data is all contributed data and is owned by whoever the source of that data is. I think I'm just in time to come to my concluding slide. So my point, I think, is that I've only talked about one identifier and one issue, which is name authority control. It's only a single component of library metadata, but it's long been one of our most expensive endeavors. It's something we've always sought to cooperate in providing because it is costly, and it's always been beneficial to achieve more through cooperation, which we've done for years through the Programme for Cooperative Cataloguing. However, management of ISNIs in the supply chain provides us a new opportunity to share cost and to share value. So my contention is that maybe, and hopefully, the global supply chain becomes part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew McKeon. Thank you for explaining to us the implementation of the ISNI into the metadata supply chain.
Thank you.
Now let's move on now to our second speaker for Edinburgh, Scotland. He is an independent consultant with important experiences in academic libraries and research in digital libraries and bibliographic metadata. He has been involved in the development of the IFLA's bibliographic standards for several years and on RDA since the beginning. He is a former chair of the RDA steering committee. In 2016, he received an IFLA medal for his work with linked data. His prolific work can be found on this site, gordonsire.com, and on YouTube. His speech titled Bibliographic Control in the Fifth Information Age fits perfectly with the title of our conference. Let's wait no longer. Please welcome Gordon Dansire.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for inviting me to speak at this conference. This presentation is going to be a look into the future, really based on the evidence of the past. And I'm going to go back to basics and ask some fairly fundamental questions and make some fairly fundamental observations. So what do we mean by bibliographic control? It's actually quite difficult to pin down a short and succinct definition that's acceptable to everybody. We've already had quotes in previous presentations about what bibliographic control is. The one I'm going to use here is from the Library of Congress report from 2008. It's the organization of library materials to facilitate discovery, management, identification, and access. The IFLA library reference model published in 2017, however, refers to the bibliographic universe as the universe of discourse. And this is really the first time that this kind of phrasing starts to appear in our theoretical models. What's discourse? It's the spoken or written communication between people, especially serious discussion of a particular subject. We can dispense with the seriousness, as I will show later in the presentation. Therefore, this presentation and I will use a definition of bibliographic control, which is the description of persistent products of human discourse across all sensory modes, all forms of recorded human memory. Why should we control any of this? What's the control bit about? Well, recorded human memory and the ability to look at recorded human discourse is absolutely essential for social cohesion. Unless we can communicate with each other, we will fight with each other. It's also the basis of cultural evolution, and bibliographic control is a reflection of a particular culture in a particular moment in time. Bibliographic control is therefore connected to the organization and management of collective human memory. That is the collection of all human memories, which when taken together are synonymous, in my opinion, with cultural heritage itself. How do we control bibliographically? I go back to the basics again and look at S.R. Ranganathan, whose famous dictum, paraphrased, is "to every reader their book, to every book its reader." I paraphrase it to remove sexist language. We must now interpret this beyond its literal meaning. The term book, we should now assume, is any piece of recorded memory. It's something that needs to be described, and it's of the past. By definition, anything that has been recorded is already in the past by the time you reread it. The reader, on the other hand, must now be defined as any living human being, and not necessarily anybody who can read. And the reader represents the presence, the now. What are my information needs right now? And the "to" into every reader of their book, that two-letter conjunction, actually conceals everything that we do. It is a very short label for the vast complexity of the profession that we're engaged in. How do we get the reader to the book? How do we get the book to the reader? This clearly involves issues of transportation, of reproduction, and indeed of the provision of metadata. But all three of these are necessary to provide access. There's absolutely no point in metadata telling me that the book I want is easily available on Mars, if I could put it that way. I have to be able to get there. If we look at this as an artifact of human culture, a basis of human culture, we have a very, very long time span to look at. And in particular, we can see that cultural evolution, certainly in the context of information, is punctuated by the impact of just a few quite specific innovations in communication technology. And these have had a profound and revolutionary effect on the development of human society and culture, with the benefit of hindsight, I must add. The four innovations that I think are the most important are writing, printing, telecommunication, and the internet. Each of these innovations has, in my opinion, resulted in a paradigm shift in recorded discourse. The nature of that discourse, the subject of that discourse, the format of that discourse. Each innovation leads to the next innovation. They build on one another. You can't have the internet without telecommunication. You can't have telecommunication without printing, and you can't have printing without writing. So this whole thing justifies a categorization of the history of human memory, what we deal with, into 5 information ages. The first information age is prehistory, a misnomer. In the first information age, recorded discourse is a rare phenomenon. The main transmission of cultural memory is achieved through the oral tradition, and the oral tradition is never recorded. And it's recorded in the sense that it's recorded in the mind of the person who receives the message, but when that person dies, the message dies with them, unless they can transmit the message to the next person in line. But nothing is being recorded here except inside a human mind. The content of recorded discourse or recorded memory is mostly representational and depictive. And I'm saying mostly because we simply don't know, and we must assume that we have yet to discover other examples of recorded discourse through excavation, etc. It's mainly figurative as it happens, and this has led later generations to only be able to really represent or discuss the recorded discourse of the first information age as art, using our modern aesthetic sense. Reproduction of this recorded discourse is expensive. It's as expensive as creating the original by definition. The originals are all unique carriers. There is one cave painting on one cave wall, what the LRM calls manifestation singletons. And access is difficult. We don't know whether access is being made deliberately difficult. Certainly the evidence is that a significant number of cave paintings are actually found deep in the recesses of caves. They're not visible from the outside. You have to know where the cave is and which cave passage to go down, and remember everything is pitch black. If it's not a matter of finding the cave, it's a matter of transporting a piece of portable recorded memory, but the means of creating portable items, the materials available are very often friable and fragile. The second information age starts with the invention of writing. Writing can appear on caves, as it were, on rock walls, but it can also appear on far more portable media. Once writing's invented, recorded discourse becomes commonplace. It's no longer a rare thing. And it starts to form a persistent linguistic memory of the human species. It's a linguistic memory because writing itself is linguistic in nature. The content shifts significantly from being mostly depictive to mostly descriptive. And this has a profound and immediate impact on the activities of commerce, religion, the law, and indeed personal life. The carriers of recorded discourse in the second information age remain unique. They are manifestation singletons. It is easier to reproduce a piece of writing, but it requires a skill set, etc., and remains relatively expensive, even though mechanically it's easier to achieve. Access is certainly less difficult. Some material, some recorded discourse, particularly in the form of religious or legal discourse, it is inscribed in situ, and the reader has to go to the item to get the information. But writing also introduces a far greater range of materials that can be used to carry the information: bark, papyrus, and various other leaf-like materials become available to carry writing. The third information age begins with the mechanization of printing. It's important to understand the mechanization aspect of this because forms of printing actually appear fairly early on in the second information age in the form of seal cylinders, etc. But they have a very, very limited use, and it's possibly arguable that a seal cylinder containing somebody's name is in fact recorded discourse. But we're going to be generous and general in this analysis. So the third information age truly starts when printing becomes mechanized, generally acknowledged to be movable type, certainly in the West. Recorded discourse becomes commonplace. However, it remains mediated earlier by artists or scribes. In the third information age, it's printers and publishers who become the mediators between the reader and their book. The content remains descriptive and is joined by depictive content. The mechanical reproduction of images becomes possible with the mechanization of printing. And we start to see the development of scholarly communication for the first time. Carriers are now available as multiple copies, truly published manifestations in the LRM sense. Reproduction is much, much cheaper. And access becomes far easier. The reader goes to the bookseller or embryonic libraries, or arranges for somebody to bring the book to them through transportation. The fourth information age begins with the general invention of telecommunication technologies. Some of the older participants here may remember Our World, which was the first global live television event where the Beatles played All You Need Is Love live, and was one of the first great phenomena of the fourth information age, certainly in terms of culture. In the fourth information age, things start to change quite radically. Recorded discourse actually becomes necessary. In order to use telecommunications technologies, it's necessary to encode and decode messages. In other words, they have to be recorded. The act of encoding is an act of recording. The content immediately expands beyond what can be reproduced on a flat surface. And it now covers audio-visual media, film, video, and audio recording. Carriers become intangible. You don't necessarily are able to feel them. Reproduction is necessary. Access becomes localized. The reader doesn't have to go anywhere near the book. The book is always delivered to the reader. So there has been a complete change in how this process actually works. The fifth information age starts with the invention of the global internet. And things explode all over the place. It is now unavoidable to record discourse. It's extremely difficult to prevent yourself being recorded if you're using the global internet. Everything is recorded. Every reader becomes potentially an author. Everything that the reader does is recorded, and this is an act of authorship. There aren't just multiple reproductions available, but there are multiple carrier formats available. And again, reproduction is unavoidable. Access is completely localized. Readers now expect to get information anytime, anywhere, and everybody should be receiving this information, have this ability. So those are the 5 information ages. It goes without saying that we are living in the 5th information age. And the point I want to make about information ages is that in every case, these punctuated inventions have had an immediate and deep impact on culture, on how humans go about their business. And there's been a longer term gradual impact, which gets more and more profound and may constitute a paradigm shift as time goes by. So we can't yet assess what the impact of the 5th information age is going to be. We can see its immediate effects, and much of this conference has been discussing those effects. But it's extremely difficult to look into the future. Who could have guessed when telecommunications first started? Remember the famous story about IBM thinking they might sell 5 mainframe computers as their entire range of production. You can't second guess the future. These inventions have significant and deep effects on cultural heritage and the way human beings conduct their business. If we now look at metadata, which is what we're here to do, we find that metadata itself is a product of the 3rd information age. It starts with the invention of printing, and as I've hinted at earlier, it's the invention of printing that leads to the development of libraries. And when you have libraries, large collections that suit more than one person, they're non-personal collections of books, you need catalogs. And so metadata is a phenomenon from the 3rd information age. Metadata content remains primarily linguistic. This is a phenomenon of the 3rd information age. Metadata is best conveyed as text, which can be translated into spoken word using screen readers, rather than visual objects. An image thumbnail isn't really metadata, it's a depiction of the image, but at a smaller scale. It doesn't describe the image. The author of metadata, if metadata itself is a product of human discourse, the author of the metadata is traditionally called a cataloger. However, in the 5th information age, as I've already pointed out, authors are readers, are users. And so we should ask ourselves whether our readers and users are in fact also catalogers. I have a criticism of the current approaches to bibliographic control. They are absolutely embedded in the paradigms of the 3rd and 4th information ages. We are only just beginning to see what the 5th information age impact might be. But I think it's safe to say that it will be profound, and it will have a profound effect on current approaches to bibliographic control. So I want to examine 2 or 3 of the areas where I think this impact is likely to be most felt. This one, identity management, has been a theme, I think, that's emerged from this conference. Identity management is clearly a major component of bibliographic control now and in the future. Identity management answers the question, who or what is the subject of metadata? What does the metadata actually describe? As Andrew's pointed out already today, the central paradigm of authority control is to do with identity management, and it arises because of two basic issues, which are to do with the linguistic processes of human discourse. The first is that a single referent, a single thing, may have many names, many titles, access points, or identifiers. And to complicate things further, many things may share a name with other things. And identity management or authority control is entirely focused on dealing with these issues. However, issue number 2 is eliminated in the 5th information age. It's the invention of the internet leads to the concept of the URI, or the Internationalized Resource Identifier, IRI, which are guaranteed to be global within the context of the semantic web. It doesn't mean that you don't have one IRI for one thing. It means there remain many IRIs for one thing, but one IRI can only refer to one thing, and it cannot refer to many different things, and thus issue 2 is no longer a problem. The second issue, again, has been alluded to during the conference. It's the AAA principle that anybody can say anything about anything. This is one of the bases of the ideas behind the semantic web, which is built on the internet. If anybody can say anything about anything, then it becomes quite important that we know who said something. This post may be unsafe. This piece of apparent recorded human discourse may be entirely fake. In fact, this is a paradox of discourse itself. If I say this statement is false, then I generate a linguistic paradox, because if the statement truly is false, then it's true. And of course, if the statement is true, then it's false. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that resource description framework avoids any test of validity or truth. Not only do we need to know who said something, and I'm really talking about metadata here, who created the metadata. It's also important to know when the metadata was created and what standards were used, if any, because standards evolve over time and things change. One of the phenomena associated with the semantic web and the 5th information age is the idea of an open world. Again, this has been alluded to, but not in any great depth during the conference so far. And the open world assumption is in fact embedded in the 5th information age. It's part of the basis of layering on top of the internet itself. And to paraphrase the principle, what it says is the absence of a particular statement, that is, we can interpret this as a metadata statement, implies that the statement has not yet been made. It doesn't imply that the statement cannot be made. It hasn't been made yet. And it's also irrespective of validity or truth values. It really doesn't matter whether the statement itself is true or not. And it does not matter whether the reader thinks it's true or not. This is the open world assumption. In the fifth information age, then, closed world assumptions as the basis of metadata and information retrieval start to become ineffective. There's no such thing as a record in the fifth information age under the open world assumption. The metadata that describes any one thing will always accumulate, not least because I can say an infinite number of false things about anything. And people do. There is no updating by replacing data. We've had some early warning of the problems with this with wiki wars, where specific articles in Wikipedia, for example, are flip-flopped between different political or other cultural points of view. And in fact, Wikipedia has had to introduce mediation devices. Nothing gets deleted. New versions are produced, but the old versions remain as valid, whatever that means, as the new version. In fact, all is treated to be the same, to be, quote, true or valid in a particular context. And finally, the monetization of metadata, which is becoming all too prevalent on the basis that somebody has to pay, is a barrier to participation in human discourse and in the fifth information age. How do we make any sense of this? The fifth information age itself provides some tools. One of the most powerful of these that's been used so far is statistical analysis of large quantities of data, leading to the law of large numbers and a regression to the mean. In other words, if you ask the audience, if you look at machine readable metadata and run statistical processes against it, it's quite possible to come to some kind of mechanical consensus about, I hesitate to use the word true or false, but certainly what is consensus. This is the basis of search engines such as Google. And I want to put to bed at this point any hope that artificial intelligence is going to produce a deus ex machina and suddenly resolve all of these problems. It's not. It's a tool, and it's not a substitute for a human being or for a cataloger's judgment. And in my opinion, it never will be, although I'm foolishly looking into the future. Another method of determining consensus when anybody can say anything about anything is to look at conscious feedback. This is the equivalent of Ask the Audience in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and similar quiz shows. In many, many cases, the audience is right, and there is a clear weight towards what the correct answer might be. Now, this is a form of consensus, and it's conscious. The audience votes and says, I think this is correct. And this is very, very similar to the like versus dislike phenomenon that we see all over the internet at the moment. The other conscious feedback mechanism, which has been explored in I think, far too mild a way at the moment, is crowdsourced metadata, where crowds have been invited to add to the quality of metadata in the past. The results have been quite successful. And we do have to ask why crowdsourced metadata hasn't become more prevalent. And part of the answer is because to crowdsource metadata, you have to make it free. And while metadata remains behind paywalls, it's very difficult to get the crowd to source it. And finally, something more exciting, there's research going on to this now, is subconscious feedback. Right now, this takes the form of tracking eye movements. If you have a virtual reality device on, not only does it project images onto your eyeball, it can record what your eyeball is looking at within those images. This is entirely subconscious. You cannot control the movement of your eyeball. It is a direct link to your brain, neurologically speaking. And I think there's quite a lot of great promise here that using subconscious feedback mechanisms, we may be able to improve, or at least arrive at a consensus and improve metadata quality that way. So in conclusion, in my opinion, the future of bibliographic control assumes an open world, not a closed world. It has to coordinate metadata created not just by professionals such as ourselves, but also by users and machines. We have heard reference to machine-created metadata in the conference, but not too much about user-created metadata. Bibliographic control must provide and use metadata provenance for context and quality control. This is the new big thing so far as I'm concerned. Without metadata provenance, whatever we do, expensive though it is going to get swamped, completely swamped by the noise of metadata coming from users and machines. The future frees metadata as a common and necessary good. It's the information on the information superhighway. Bibliographic control manages local cultural identity in a global framework, and as a result becomes indistinguishable from culture, whatever that means. When I hear the word, I reach for a gun. A technological extension of intellect or the human mind in society. Thank you. There's further information, and for the benefit of the YouTube recording, I have to display the 2 image credit screens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon, for your very engaging speech. We have 3 questions for you. I'm sorry to ask you to answer briefly.
Sure.
Pierluigi Felicitati, what do you think about the proof and trust top layers of the semantic web schema, the birthday cake, the abundance of accessible and diachronic documentation about sources, authors, editors may cover the proof layer at least? What about trust? Thank you.
Well, trust comes from, I think, local cultural identity. So I'm not going to answer that specifically in the context of cataloging, but trust is a glue in cultures. Local cultures trust one another because there is a common understanding of their cultural heritage. It may be true or false. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false. The trust is in consensus. So my answer to that question is consensus and not necessarily authority.
Okay. Mathilde Fontaine, do you think the rise of Web 2.0 marks the beginning of a further meaningful information age? Or do you think this development is less meaningful as regards the production of documents and consequently the need for bibliographic control?
That's a difficult one. I'll just check the question again.
Can I repeat?
That's what's thrown me. Web 2.0, it's quite an old term, I have to say. It was in vogue about 10 years ago, Web 2. I regard it as synonymous with the semantic web and therefore the fifth information age. So I don't see it as an intermediary stage. I do think that globalized metadata will be based, at least for the foreseeable future, on resource description framework. And that, I think, is what is meant by Web 2.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The last question. Would the fourth information age have begun with the invention of a telegraph in the 19th century?
I believe so. It's quite difficult to pin these things down, and there's no universal thing going on here. Writing's invented over periods of thousands of years in different cultures. Telecommunications, I guess you could say, starts with, in some sense, the Pony Express, mm-hmm. even though it's not tele. But this is long distance communication, which goes beyond the range of normal human senses. So I do not include semaphore or other means of communication over a distance, which just use normal human senses. So yes, I agree. The telegraph is probably the first of the inventions of telecommunication. So it does start in the 19th century. But it only really comes into fruition, I believe, around about the middle of the 1950s. And certainly it's post-World War II in the way it starts to impact on human culture and human discourse.
Okay, if you want, there is just now another question on the fly. What about the future of RDA and BibFrame? It's a big question.
And the consensus. Short answer, consensus.
Consensus. Okay. Thank you very much, Gordon.
Thank you.
Best wishes. Now, I'm very pleased to present our next speaker, who is the Officer of Information Standard Policy at the Metadata Department of the National Library of France. She is a member of many committees of the IFLA cataloging section and lately of the European RDA interest group, EURIC. It is also due to her work and that of her staff that the French catalogs are always at the forefront in putting the latest theories into practice. It will be particularly interesting because she is involved in the French Bibliographic Transition Program, where she chairs the group which develops the new French cataloging code based on the IFLA LRM model and partially adapted from RDA. The title of her speech today is Rethinking Bibliographic Control in the Light of IFLA LRM Entities, the Ongoing Process and the National Library of France. Please welcome Françoise Leroche. Françoise? I can see you. I can't see you. I don't know. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Here
Sorry,
you are.
I have forgotten. And I have no webcam with me, so I will only speak. And so,
can you share slides? No.
Yes. Okay. Of course.
Thank you.
Okay. So do you see my screen now?
Yes, we see it perfectly.
And you hear me well?
Perfectly, yes.
So thank you for organizing this conference and inviting me. So it will give me the opportunity to present how the BNF catalog is evolving towards LRM, and the consequences in terms of cataloging policies in a broader sense. So I will go, as many speakers here, I go back to the fundamental. So the foundation stones of concept of universal bibliographic control were laid by Dorothy Henderson at the first International Conference on Cataloging Principles in Paris, and formalized by the same Dorothy Henderson in a text published in 1974. The text summarizes the stakes and principle of international cooperation based on coordinated policies. The requirements that cataloging should respect international standards set by consensus and within IFLA's framework is one of the most important in this respect. The objective was to describe all resources published worldwide and split this task internationally by developing tools such as the ISBD and Unimark for the exchange of descriptive metadata. However, in the beginning, the discussion around bibliographic exchange between countries focused only on publications and especially printed publications, because in that time, publications were considered the very essence of the cultural production a nation ought to preserve for present and future generations. Today, the cultural and technical context has radically changed with the web. Catalogers and users around the world use online catalogs as search and discovery systems. Libraries open up to new and exciting perspectives of visibility and data reconciliation by making the bibliographic information contained in their catalogs available as open data on the semantic web. As a step to achieve this goal, libraries are aiming to build web-oriented catalogs based on the IFLA LRM model. When the ISBD resource is split into the 4 WEMI entities, it seems necessary to adopt a new approach towards UBC and to define new criteria. If you go back in the recent years, we have the experience of authority files. And authority files were established to control authorized access points representing agents, persons, corporate bodies, or families associated with bibliographic records in the catalog. But an authority record not only defines the authoritative form to be systematically applied as an entry in bibliographic descriptions within the said catalog. It also gathers together all the information needed to identify the entity in question. Its value is acknowledged in that it carries information verified by experts, which can be reused in very different contexts. Authority files allow us to appreciate the level of engagement a national bibliographic agency can have on metadata identifying not only bibliographic resources, namely publications, but also agents such as persons or corporate bodies. A commonly adopted solution is to provide full identification metadata that becomes the international reference for the national agents or regarded as such. In French authority files, the agent attribute nationality was defined and very used early on, but it was met with international misunderstanding as the concept of nationality can vary according to countries or culture. Today, the prevailing notion is that of country associated with an agent. which is more than enough when the matter is to define the responsibilities regarding UBC. Which UBC criteria for the WEMIS entities? It seems only natural that the same logic experimented for agents should apply to instances of entities present in every bibliographic resource as understood by the ISBD, namely to works and expression materialized in manifestations to which the original UBC definition still applies. Today, the orientations that BNF considers to know whether a work or an expression falls within its responsibility as a national bibliographic agency, as defined by UBC, takes into account the following criteria. First, the place of publication or diffusion of the first manifestation materializing the representative expression of the work. The language of the representative expression of the work, and finally, the nationality of creators if the language criteria doesn't apply, for example, for resource of a still image or music, or as a complement to it, for example, for all the French-speaking literature. What exactly does this new approach mean, and what are its practical implications? In the case of a manifestation published in France and materializing the original expression of a work by a French author, little actually changes from the current approach. The reference identification of the manifestation, but also of the work and its representative expression, fall within the responsibility of the French National Bibliographic Agency, namely the BNF. Here is an example of this case with a novel written by a French author, Patrick Modiano, with two expressions, the second one created by a French actor who reads the text. The manifestations are all published in France. So in this case, BNF has the responsibilities for all the instances for the three entities. However, in the case of a manifestation published in France that contains a French translation of a foreign work, the responsibility of BNF in reference identification at an international level only applies to the manifestation and the expressions that correspond to the French translation. The French National Bibliographic Agency does not hold any specific responsibility regarding the identification of a foreign work and can limit itself to its functional needs. Here, this slide shows an example of this second situation. The work is Il Barone Rampante, work which was created by Italo Calvino, an Italian author, and belongs to the Italian literature. In consequence, the work and its representative expression fall within the responsibility of the Italian National Bibliographic Agency for identification at the international level. On the other hand, BNF is in charge of establishing the reference identification for the various French translations of the work and the associated translator. So here you see what pertains to BNF and what pertains to Italy. While considering such criteria in delimiting the respective responsibilities of the bibliographic agencies, the country where the manifestation embodying the representative expression of the work was published is an extension of the most important criterion applicable to manifestation. And as such, it is a continuation of the current practice. It seems easy to put into practice within a traditional framework, book-in-hand cataloging by catalogers for print material, such text, notated music, maps. But it is not as easily applicable to audiovisual resources, which raise other questions as their distribution network largely ignores the concept of publication in the traditional sense. What matters most, both for moving images or sound, is the production process. But taking into account the production level would prove just as ineffective, since as far as recorded music is concerned, most producers are European or multinational firms. As for cinematographic resources, co-productions associating various countries are increasing. In second position, the language criterion spontaneously comes to mind, but it is not sufficient. On the one hand, it applies only to works and expression having a textual component or aspect. On the other hand, some languages are shared by many countries, and it is the case for the French language. That is why the concept of country associated with agent has increasingly taken into account, since this is often the most objective criterion we have to determine the country associated with a work, as well as an expression. It is therefore becoming an essential criterion, especially for the treatment of the legal deposit of audiovisual resources. Nowadays, resources are widely digitally distributed. Massively so for audiovisual resources, sound recordings, motion picture and series, but also for continuing resources and even also to a lesser content for books, music score, maps, and so on. Their massive arrival in library collections comes with metadata produced beforehand by commercial actors whose practice and goals are different from libraries. In this regard, the metadata associated with digital resources and provided by vendors or aggregators in the case of legal deposit for sound recordings are characterized by their heterogeneity. Depending on the source they come from, descriptive data can vary both in exhaustivity and structure, from minimal descriptions to other much more detailed. But disambiguating names, especially for agent, rarely tends to be a priority, and this is a problem for us. A second characteristic is their granularity. Manifestation as a material unique federating several contents, as it is mostly the case for sound recordings, where aggregates are the rule, tend to disappear in favor of the individuation of each track, with a quite exhaustive list of participants, creators, performers, but also technical and commercial responsibilities, to such a level that was never done by libraries. It is up to libraries to rebuild the aggregates that correspond to the album, meaning the published manifestation. And finally, they are also characterized by their mass. When confronted to the massive flow of exogenous data, one has to face the impossibility of their being reviewed, validated, and improved by catalogers. One has to accept that some will never be enhanced, nor will their quality be improved by any other means than an automated mass treatment. For many years, BNF has had a cataloging policy that takes into account its role as a national bibliographic agency tasked with the French National Bibliography. This document is regularly updated so as to follow the evolution of the edition market as well as the bibliographic and technical context. In 2017, the decision was made to fully implement the IFLA LRM model in the catalog of BNF by changing the structuration of metadata according to LRM entities, starting with the 4 WEMI entities. The NOEMI project ambitions to develop a new cataloging system that will allow the creation of linked LRM entities in conjunction with another project, the French National Entities File, FNE. FNE's objective is to centralize the production and circulation of identification metadata produced by French libraries and in priority by BNF and the ABES network for entities that are traditionally described in authority files. So it's concerned agents such as persons, families, and corporate bodies, but also places, concepts such as described in subject authority files. So in France, we have the Rameau subject of authority file, as well as works and eventually expressions. In parallel to this project, BNF has been working on a quality policy for metadata, whether the metadata present in the catalog are originally created by BNF catalogers or provided by outside sources. Such a quality policy is based on the LRM modeling and user task defined in the model. As implementing the LRM model, both entity and relationships, aims to provide quality data that meet the various needs of end users. So for us at BNF, drawing up a quality policy is considered as a tool to reach UBC objectives. The approach adopted by BNF is an entity-centered approach. Instances of entities are considered for themselves, irrespective of the cataloging context. So we consider only the identification of a specific work or agent, regardless of the carrier or media types of the manifestation, which allows to break free from biases induced by the legal deposit channels. This approach is core to the FNE project and the shared cataloging process that it promotes. It entails to grant each instance of entity with their own quality level indication that may be different from that of another instance linked to it. The assessment of quality is much finer and granular than it is today, where the bibliographic records as a whole is granted a quality level, often linked to the cataloging channel that created it. We distinguish at BNF a French National Bibliography with a high level of quality and acquisition with less intensive cataloging and work for identification. In this policy, differentiated quality levels are defined, conceived as concentric circles of quality that take into account three key criteria. First, the responsibility regarding UBC. Exhaustive reference identification for instances of entities that meet the criteria to define a responsibility of National Bibliographic Agency, as presented before, or nuanced, less demanding quality levels for others. Second, the ability to meet user needs, such as defined in the IFLA-LRM model. Building authorized and variant access points to provide access to the described instances, identifying and recording relationships between instances, core WEMI relationships, but also responsibility relationships between agent and the WEMI, relationships between works, expression, and manifestation. And finally, choosing the recording method for these relationships. So we all know the four methods: node, structure, access point, and identifiers, and permanent identifiers. Finally, the traceability of metadata, aiming when possible for fine-grained granularity attached to elements of information. The provenance of the information, addition coming from external sources, such as summaries provided by vendors, as well as indication about the processing, automatic processing or manual work that was done to the data so as to improve their quality. This information allows to assess metadata according to everyone's needs, as well as customized quality criteria associated with such use. Implementing the IFLA-LRM in BNF's catalog was a choice aiming to improve efficiency due to the factorization of information at the work level for subject analysis and relationships between agents and work, or expression level also for the relationships between agents and expression, and also the accurate descriptions of aggregates, which is particularly useful for multiple manifestations published either simultaneously or over time. It is also deemed to be an assurance of quality as far as data completion and consistency in the catalog are concerned. Referring to the IFLA-LRM model is also a guarantee of interoperability with other libraries, regardless of different implementation choices, such as shortcuts, etc., as well as interoperability with other heritage communities, especially archive services and museums. UBC relies on sharing the work of counting and describing, which means exchanging data between countries and bibliographic agencies. Shifting from a logic of bibliographic description such as defined by the SBD to linked LRM entities and a relational structure of catalogs is problematic for exchange, as the situations of bibliographic agency are very diverse. Even so, nowadays, most catalogs are structured around bibliographic records linked to authority records. The shift to relational databases structured around LRM entities will happen progressively and at various rhythms, formats, and means. The continuity of exchanges between bibliographic agencies whose implementation choices are dependent on various time constraints will likely mean to accommodate a period of transition where LRMized data will have to be converted so as to provide bibliographic records compliant with the ISBD, along with linked authority records such as what exists today. This is the commitment that ABES and BNF, the two French bibliographic agencies, have taken to French libraries in the context of the National Bibliographic Transition Programme. Worldwide libraries will, of course, also benefit from it, but this twofold way of providing data will not last forever and will follow the evolution of French catalogues towards the new LRMized structure. Meanwhile, within the French UNIMAR committee, the two agencies are actively working towards for future evolution of the UNIMAR format, both the bibliographic and the authority format, that will allow it to accommodate LRM entities and relationships. The goal is to go on providing libraries with a rich, fine-grained international exchange format to exchange the bibliographic data that they produce and use regardless of the structure of their catalog, in accordance with the goals of UBC, which remain valid beyond the technological changes that have transformed the context of library catalogs. And thank you, and sorry for reading my text with my bad...
Don't worry, don't worry. Thank you for your remarkable talk. We have a question for you, but I have to ask to answer briefly. From Heidrun Muller, does the nomen entity of a LRM play any role in the French approach?
We have not, we implement the nomen entity as an attribute and not as an entity itself, because our decision is to consider for each entity, instance of entity, we have a record, a distinct record. So we will not, we use the nomen entity as an attribute with metadata to manage the attributes of the nomen entities in the LRM model.
Thank you very much, Françoise Laroche. Thank you. Bye. And now our next speaker is the CEO of a small but very important Italian company, which supplies bibliographical data, books, journals, e-content material, and related services to libraries all over the world. His company is highly experienced in dealing with changes, also according to new conceptual models, and it manages to anticipate its customers' requests, which are the most advanced libraries in the world. I could say much more, but I prefer to give him the floor. The title of his speech is "The Future of Bibliographic Services in the Light of New Concepts of Authority Control." So here he is, Michele Casalini of Casalini Libri.
Thank you, Maria Chiara, and thank you all for being here. This presentation aims to offer insight into some of the practical aspects that have emerged from the experience of elaborating, experimenting, and bringing new forms of authority control into operation. It is also based on the cooperation and active contribution of many colleagues, both in the library world and within Casarini Libri and et al., to whom I'm extremely grateful. The surprising technological innovation and the great changes that have occurred in the field of cataloging have opened the doors to new horizons that see machines play a proactive and effective role in the decoding and sharing of bibliographical metadata. It is thanks to these new advances in technology that it is possible to overcome linguistic barriers and ventures beyond purely bibliographic fields. The present era of a growing enormous quantity, sometimes perishable, data calls those who operate in the cultural heritage sector to perform a task of fundamental importance, to react to the need for an authority control that, into brackets, guarantees the homogeneity, stability, and formal quality of access entries as an integral operation within the cataloging ecosystem. It is a technique influenced by the technology of its time, as well as by the standards and cataloging conventions in use in the context of linguistic, cultural, and disciplinary specializations. To comply with a new open philosophy of data sharing and reuse, the concept of traditional authority records is therefore evolving as well. The transition from the concept of a record to that to entity in the context of the semantic web has forced a rethinking not only of the data, but also of the organization and management of authority control itself. Previous discussion on whether authority control should be centrally or locally based will morph, as the focus shifts from a rigid conception to a more flexible notion of entity identification and relationships between entities. In combination with technological developments that support this course, it has been necessary to radically rethink the conceptual models of data interpretation. The transition from the functional requirement of bibliographic records to IFLA library reference model has propelled the international community toward a new modeling of bibliographic levels, linked together by primary relationships and accompanied by further relationships with entities and properties. The bibliographic control function continues to be valid today, but shifts the focus to a global level, supporting growing international cooperation, which is facilitated now by the interoperability of the data models. The contribution of a heterogeneous group of organizations concerned with the dissemination of knowledge also promotes cooperative authority control, with collaboration and mutual assistance among actors of various kinds. By comparing and integrating their data with those of others, the information they convey will be more complete and more reliable. Organizations such as libraries, archives, museums, but also publishers and providers will engage with each other in the generation of new data and the discovery of new resources, crossing the boundaries of specific domains to create data enrichment opportunities that would previously have been unthinkable. To implement the interoperability of metadata, it has become necessary, as we know, to create a new conformation and structure so that each entity can be identifiable by a single and unambiguous name or code to be used by all agencies creating bibliographic metadata. The uniform resource identifier avoids the ambiguity of using natural language. Data structured according to the resource description framework data model, in contrast to the data of traditional record-based approach, focuses on individual metadata declaration represented by triples of data in the subject, predicate, object form. These triples can become quads in order to declare the provenance information that is functional to taking advantage of the enrichment and data through authoritative sources, while maintaining local preferences for the labeling and display of data through customizable application profiles. Statements can be combined and matched from any different sources to link different standards and models as well, such as Resource Description and Access, RDA, and the Bibliographic Framework Initiative, BibFrame. The schemas expressed in RDF linked data structure allow other communities to reuse the data in their own environments. Following the path initiated, developed, and progressively applied by the Library of Congress with BibFrame, encouraged by the vision of the linked data for production projects promoted by Stanford University, and in light of the extensive and exciting possibilities offered by new technologies and data models, in 2016, a community-driven initiative emerged, the Share Virtual Discovery Environment, with the aim of putting them into practice to apply them to a shared catalog environment for the benefit to libraries and their users. As one of the founding organizations of the Share VDE initiative and in its role of a bibliographic agency, Casalini Libri has been and continues to be active in testing linked data technologies for libraries together with its technological arm and sister company at CALT. Building on the experience of all involved parties, and drawing from it, one of the aims of Share VDE has been to develop innovative approaches for the authority control of bibliographic records and for the creation of improvement of authority control procedures, enabling new authority services to libraries and supporting their transition to linked data. The starting point of this evolution, like the initiative itself, stems from the real and emerging needs of the library community, more specifically the need for libraries to receive constantly updated information on their bibliographic and authority records from authoritative sources, both in machine-readable catalog, MARC format, and in BibFrame linked data structure. The services designed and the underlying technological infrastructure are the result of the development of the new linked open data technologies influenced by the direct input of the various Share family collaborative environments involving national and research libraries. These processes facilitated the experimentation for creation and handling of linked data entities, but also provide direct interaction with operational library systems that will for a long time coexist in both MARC and RDF. Among the overall goals, there are the enrichment of MARC records with identifiers from external sources as ISNI and VIAF, the reconciliation and clusterization of entities and the publication of the clustered knowledge base, the conversion from MARC to RDF using the BibFrame vocabulary together with other ontologies, batch automated authority services, data updating and data dissemination procedure, a manual entity management tool, the data publication on an entity-oriented user interface. An active role in determining directions and priorities is played by the Share VDE Advisory Council and by the various working groups. One of those is dedicated to the Authority Identifier Management Services. The flexibility in handling and in profiling external sources is a crucial aspect for the involved processes, as each institution may have a different priority list. Wikidata is an example where the interaction allows searching the source and enriching the Share VDE data with Wikidata entity information, and vice versa, as Share VDE has a property on Wikidata for the author ID. From the technological viewpoint, the application programming interfaces API architecture simplifies interconnections, reusability, sustainability, and scalability, opening the window to an open world. But the challenge of the data interoperability among systems that is indispensable to bring into practice implementations at a wide scale requires comparison among data models and mapping that allow not to lose granularity of information. With this aim, the ShareVDE Entity Identification Working Group has approved last June the Opus class, that is also a BIP framework, as the ShareVDE work is too. Further details on this structure can be found on the wiki.svde.org. It is important to highlight that ShareVDE is trying to practically reconcile an approach to entity modeling, North American-oriented BIP frame with a Eurocentric approach, IFLA-RRM. This reconciliation aims to create a flexible crossover between different cataloging practices, thus allowing to adapt to different data modeling contexts that cannot be confined in restricted geographical, linguistic, cultural borders. Such trade union has been facilitated by some important European libraries that have joined ShareVDE, the National Library of Norway, the National Library of Finland, and the British Library. We have now mentioned several of the pillars that relate to one another to create the broader ecosystem with a ShareVDE cluster knowledge base in the center named Sapientia. Around it, you can find clockwise the API layer backend to interconnect with other environments, the skin and tenant architecture, the authority flow handling both automatic and manual processes, traditional data flows in MARC or entity-oriented ones, interoperability factors with other data models. The cluster knowledge base Sapientia represents the ambition to build an authoritative knowledge base with the tools to improve it with one mechanical algorithms, but also to an editor, JCricket, which allows a transversal community including data producers, of course, librarians, to collaborate jointly in order to raise the quality level of the data offered. The combination between the cluster knowledge base produced through automated processes that aggregate data from many different sources and its editor could represent a sort of ideal union of the virtual international authority file, VF Word, and the Wikidata community. That is, on the one hand, the quality and authority proposed by the VF model, and on the other hand, the open and cross-domain approach of the Wikidata model, carrying its vision of a collaborative tool open to a wide user community. Therefore, Sapientia, with its control and editing tool, JCricket, opens up to a vision that combines authority and ability to interact, openness and control combined. Automatic authority control operations allows a high level of productivity, while manual operation guarantees a high level of quality. For each context, therefore, the best balance of the two must be identified. The automated processes are divided depending on whether the library is handling a record-based ILS, an RDF-based system, or a hybrid one. These are some of the processes involved. Variables are the frequency of the data flow and whether the library also holds the authority file locally. The MARC record validator, the MARC corrections for error and obsolete forms, and the matching enrichment profile sources compose the record-based scenario. Access point enrichment, including series and subjects matching, import and interaction with the Sapientia cluster knowledge base are functional to interact with the RDF-based system. In both cases, the processes are enabled through RESTful modules of the LOT platform that provides bibliographic authority and full text search services with entity detection and identification, including relator term capabilities. The manual processes are divided into two groups. The operational tasks of the original cataloging processes to validate and enrich metadata elements, and the editing processes to enhance the common cluster knowledge base. The first set of manual processes can be characterized by the following operations. authority control of the access points of bibliographic records for similar matches and for non-matches, including the checking, validation, and the reconciliation of imported URIs. Manual enrichment of entity, work, and agents, including publishers. The creation of original authority records. Casaline Libri already does this for the ISNI in compliance with its role as an ISNI registration agency and sends reports in case of duplicate records existing for a single entity or of relationships with incorrect titles. These operations are enabled through the so-called URI registration platform. The second set of manual processes employs the cluster knowledge base editor, known as JCricket, as the instrument for the direct management of entities represented in RDF. The new application dedicated to the editing of ShareVDE community data is a collaborative tool that not only makes it possible to validate automatic matches that the clustering procedures identifies as uncertain, but also allow library professionals to merge, split, or create new clusters autonomously. Conceived as a collaborative editing environment, the application foresees different levels of access and interaction with the data, enabling users to manually create, modify, and reconcile clusters of the entity saved in the cluster knowledge base. The entities represent in Sapientia and managed by JCricket are based conceptually on the ShareVDE four labeled entity model, Opus Work Instance Item. The clusters to be modified automatically and manually are Opus Works and Agents. The next achievements will be to treat the instance as an entity. Here you can find two examples on how it is foreseen respectively that JCricket interacts with Wikidata and how Wikidata interacts with JCricket. The scope and capability of the cluster knowledge base editor will be expanded over time to include the management of authority services for libraries with quality control procedures for data. With this twofold purpose, not only will JCricket facilitate the creation and handling of linked data entities within ShareVDE, but it will also provide direct interaction with library systems, both in MARC and RDF formats. Interconnection with both the Sinopia linked data cataloging module of LD4P initiative and with the data from the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, PCC, will be the primary test bed for JCricket to prove its ability to act as a pivotal tool between the traditional MARC-based cataloging workflow and innovative linked data processes. I'm coming now to a conclusion. The linked data paradigm is laying the groundwork for a new level of cooperation among international organizations to create new bridges across the library, archives, and museum domain, which are ultimately functional to increasing discoverability for students, scholars, and the wider community, to revealing data that would be otherwise remain hidden, to contributing to promoting a culture of openness toward knowledge, and to fostering, on the one hand, the preservation of existing knowledge, and on the other, the progress undertaken by younger generation. Initiatives such as Linked Data for Production, ShareVDE, and others, with each of the involved institutions, the leading role of many national libraries, the cooperative programs such as the PCC, of the players of the information chain are crucial, not only to bringing into practice, but to reaching the critical mass of implementation on cultural heritage collections. In conclusion, the present challenge for organizations that have the bibliographic control at heart is not only to facilitate libraries to handle constantly updated information in their records, datasets from authoritative resources, but to improve the level of collaboration between actors of different natures, thanks to data interoperability in a future vision of authority control which is more open and cooperative on a global scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you for your contribution in improving the interoperability of the bibliographic universe. Thank you. Now we are going to play the video of the promoters and partners of the conference. Just about 3 minutes. Stay with us, please. Okay, here we are again with the fifth speaker. Our next speaker is from the National Library of Norway, or Nasjonalbiblioteket, which has 2 locations, Oslo and Mo i Rana. This library manages both the legal deposit and the National Bibliography of Norway. She is a senior advisor in the Department of Acquisition and Bibliographic Services. She deals with metadata standards and models, metadata analysis, and metadata quality improvement. Her work includes several activities and projects concerned with building up new services based on the national bibliography, which she will tell us about. Her speech is titled The Norwegian National Bibliography, Policy and Services. Let's give a big welcome to Oddrun Paulina Orean. Paulina? It's up to you.
Hello, do you hear
Hello?
me?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Sure.
I try to share my screen here.
Thank you.
You see this?
Yes, perfect. Can you enlarge a little bit, maybe?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Like this.
Better.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
I think before I start, I'd like to say that my talk will be a bit more general than the title indicates. In hindsight, I think that a better title, a better heading would be the National Library of Norway Policy and Services, as I will talk a little less about bibliographic things that I originally planned and more about other library services. So take this as perhaps a little break from all the intricate bibliographical models and a case description, and also perhaps a reminder of why we need bibliographical control. I will start out with describing the two most important policy documents that govern our operations, then outlining the services that we are mandated to provide before going into more direct bibliographical matters. The operation of the National Library of Norway, or NLN as I shall refer to it, is governed by the Legal Deposit Act of 1989, a latest amendment in 2015, and a new regulation in 2018. By this law, all publishers of documents made publicly available in Norway are responsible for providing those documents to the National Library for preservation and dissemination. Then we have the National Strategy for Libraries from 2020 to 2023. Also quite a deciding factor for our priorities. And lastly, the Act of Public Libraries that isn't applicable directly to us, but is important anyway because we are set to administer it on behalf of the government. When it comes to what types of material it applies to, our Act of Legal Deposit applies to any kind of documents, both physical and digital, on any media, and has done so since 1989. However, the amendments in 2015 and 2018 stipulated two very important changes. Firstly, NLN now may also require the digital files from which the published printed documents are produced, for instance, PDFs used for printing books. And secondly, we may require some core metadata with the deposit. NLN, for its part, is responsible for creating and enriching the metadata to a level befitting a national bibliography, as well as managing the catalog and catalog products. These two changes represent great opportunities for streamlining the material flow and thereby getting the content out to the people faster. Implementing the digital deposit flow for all types of material is still work in progress. Currently, all newspapers are deposited digitally, and right now we are focusing on workflow for monographs. But later, other material types will be included, like periodicals and music. And of course, one path of our workflows ends up in one of our mountain halls, in which one copy of each deposited publication or file is preserved in a controlled environment. Another important policy document is the National Strategy for Libraries 2020 to 2023, as I mentioned. That is issued by the Ministry of Culture in collaboration with the Ministry of Education and Research, and outlines a 4-year strategy comprising all types of libraries. In the lofty words of the document, libraries should develop into a space for democracy and self-cultivation. What's more, it's pointed out very strongly that the National Library is the government's main instrument and driving force to achieve this, and lists a number of duties and tasks for the National Library. It mandates us to support the other types of libraries in various specific ways, for instance, financially, through funding development projects, and structurally by way of providing crucial infrastructure to the libraries. The strategy focuses very strongly on dissemination. They say the goal is for libraries to introduce to new users to literature and reading, facilitate knowledge dissemination, and expand digital collections. The government will implement strategic measures that support libraries and librarians in attracting more users, including those who do not visit libraries. So everything we do should be in the service of dissemination. And dissemination to users both inside and outside the libraries. For NLN, this involves the responsibility to disseminate and expand our own collection in various ways on many platforms. Just as important is our obligation to do what we can to enable other libraries to offer high-quality services to their local patrons. To achieve this, NLN tries to develop shared national infrastructure to make sure that local, often thinly staffed libraries can spend their time and effort to serve their local patrons and do not have to perform work that could just as easily be performed centrally at a national level. Here is summed up what the library strategy means by infrastructure services to be provided by NLN, as well as for whom and how. Its strong focus on dissemination naturally implies a requirement to provide content as much as possible digitally, but also physically. To administer the content, bibliographical data as well as authority data of good quality are needed. Part of our duties is also to function as national competence and resource center for other institutions in the library and cultural sector. It is our task to keep up with the development within library science in general and in the bibliographic domain in particular, and provide useful standards, tools, and guidance for the whole sector. Both digital content, metadata, and authority data should be adapted for machines and humans alike, and the access mechanism must be easy to understand, well documented, and readily available. Lastly, the guiding principle is that infrastructure services that NLN provides for the library sector are to be free of charge, both for end users and for libraries, or as cheap as possible. Creating source content is the never-ending task of processing the legal deposit. This is the task which forms the foundation for everything else, and a task that is our sole responsibility. Making the content accessible to users also involves documenting it in terms of structured metadata, which ultimately forms the national bibliography. Hence, the topic of bibliographic control lies at the heart of the whole process of receiving and processing legal deposit. Through an extensive digitization project since 2006, now more than 500,000 books are digitized, practically all the books in our national bibliography. Also, about 60% of our historical newspaper collection is digitized, and all current newspapers are deposited digitally as well as in paper. In addition to handling deposited material, we also create content ourselves, mainly in some way based on our collections. For example, digital productions like podcasts and streamed events, as well as research-based publication, republishings of older literature, etc. An overall goal is that as much as possible of our content can be accessed throughout Norway. The geographical and demographical conditions being as they are, that is no small challenge. Norway is a thinly populated country, and the distance from south to north is almost as long as the distance between Oslo and Rome. At the same time, all municipalities are mandated by law to offer a public library, however small and however few people live there. Currently, a very large proportion of our physical collection is digitized and therefore available anywhere through our digital library, nb.no, and through our main catalog discovery service, Aurea. Consequently, an important part of our dissemination strategy is to negotiate agreements with IPR holders about exposing digitized material still under copyright. Right now, digital books published before 2001 may be read on any device with a Norwegian IP address. And the negotiation will be started soon to be able to include even newer books into the contract. Even though we do our best to expose as much as we can of our digital content directly to end users, this is not possible for everything. The challenges here are not, of course, technological, but legal and financial. However, through deals with publishers and their organizations, we are now able to offer digital content to be accessed in local libraries throughout the country, content that previously only was available from within our own buildings. This includes all digitized newspapers and books, also those newer than 2001. But only to be used for documentation and research, and only a few users at a time. Also, through a special deal with about 70 running newspaper, any library visitor may read them from 2 weeks after publication. I'd also like to go quickly through some more specific services that are specified in the library strategy, namely the multilingual library, then our support for interlibrary loans, and lastly, the language bank and its associated digital humanities lab. Many of the small libraries in Norway struggle to be able to offer books to their immigrant population. The multilingual library is a service for public libraries designed to remedy this to some extent. Its collection comprises literature acquired from a multitude of countries in equally many languages. While being available for all through ordinary interlibrary loan, its main purpose is to support libraries in providing services to their multilingual and multicultural population. Any public or school library may borrow mini collections or bookcases composed according to their own requirements to be used as their own holdings for a period of up to 6 months. One important objective of our library network as a whole is to provide equal access to library material to all inhabitants in the country, irrespective of their place of habitation. In Norway, with many small public libraries, interlibrary lending is by necessity an important element of the library services. To support this, NLN has provided a service called Library Research, or Biblioteksøk in Norwegian, a joint discovery and lending service covering the holdings of all Norwegian libraries. Through Biblioteksøk, users may reserve books held by any library in the country and pick it up at their local library. The NLN Depot Library, containing almost a complete set of Norwegian monographs and journals, newspaper microfilms, as well as the multilingual library collection, is by far the largest supplier to interlibrary lending. It is built up from legal deposit leftovers, transferred material from other libraries, and some purchase. The actual lending process is handled by an efficient automatic storage facility. Naturally, the depot library is extremely popular among other libraries, as it greatly decreases their own burden that interlibrary lending usually represents. Then we have the language bank, or Språkbanken in Norwegian. In order to develop high-quality language technology for Norwegian language, big data sets with Norwegian speech and text are needed, and NLN Language Bank has as its primary task to provide and organize such data sets. Our resources are aimed at researchers and students, as well as commercial companies developing language technology software. The resource collection comprise, among other things, lexical resources like WordNet and dictionaries, corpora of written and spoken languages, both in Norwegian and various dialects. The language bank is NLN's main contribution to the shared European research infrastructure called CLARIN, which is Common Language Resources and Technological Infrastructure. All our resources are available online via the National Resource Catalog, of which you see the interface on the slide, which also include language resources from other CLARIN centers in Norway. The metadata here follows the CLARIN-defined framework in which profiles and subcomponents can be defined, understood, and reused across CLARIN centers, which is very different from it's completely different from MARC 21, which is what we use for other material. Closely associated with the Language Bank is Digital Humanities Laboratory, a service supplying scholars, students, and library users with digital tools and methods in their studies, as well as assistance in their use. The library strategy mandates NLN to supply free metadata to all libraries in Norway. To be useful for the libraries, it is important that these metadata be produced as soon as information about the planned publication is available. This is because the pre-publication metadata are important sources for acquisition and ordering of new stuff in the local libraries. Currently, our internal processes in the National Library cannot guarantee such promptness. Hence, since 2017, metadata about Norwegian publications have been procured from external metadata vendors, making sure they follow our cataloging practice for the national bibliography, and also include certain elements particularly wanted by the public libraries, such as subject headings from a certain vocabulary. An important aspect of this is to always authorize agents mentioned in the metadata. Using the API, it is possible to integrate authority lookup into their own cataloging system. This way of doing things will be continued, and the National Library will assess the feasibility and necessity of expanding to free metadata for other kinds of material, such as film and music, which are not included at present. Also, the libraries have requested access to metadata for foreign material. During the strategy period, the National Library will attempt to find good solutions for including this also. This is a rough overview of the services NLN renders as mandated through the Act of Legal Deposit and the National Library Strategy, some of which I've already described. The services are grouped vertically according to type, horizontally according to target group. Concerning data services, they are in practice open for all. There is no difference between any person when it comes to any library, when it comes to accessing and using our bibliographical data, nor other research data. Content is a different thing, for which copyright is a deciding factor for availability. The clear message from the ministry is that NLN should try to overcome some of the IPR's obstacles to make as much digital content as possible available for Norwegian inhabitants. Our strategy in this respect has been, and still is, to negotiate agreements with the right owners, the publishers, to be allowed to expose content that is not in the public domain. As shown in the topmost row, such agreements affect services to end users directly, as well as services local libraries render to the patrons. Such kind of negotiating activities is a typical task for the national level. So is maintaining cataloging rules and guidelines, like RDA, which is now completely translated to Norwegian, and also providing core tools like classification system. We have WebGUI now also in Norwegian, and so is providing a website specifically dedicated to support collaboration and information exchange, as well as serve as a knowledge resource for libraries. The National Library of Norway is, as I said, responsible for developing and maintaining an online national bibliography that is a comprehensive and authoritative account of every document made publicly available in Norway, or also abroad related to Norwegian affairs. As we see it, a national bibliography is not merely a tool for information retrieval, but is in itself a valuable source of insight into a nation's cultural heritage and intellectual production, and as such forms an important part of our research infrastructure. Some parts of our national bibliography are still managed in separate legacy databases, but the main portion reside in our ILS Alma, hosted by our system partner UNIT, in a catalog shared with about 80 other academic libraries. In Alma, the national bibliography, as well as other thematic bibliographies, exist as virtual collections. The whole national bibliography can be accessed through a separate instance of ORIA, the discovery service of our main catalog. The data are also freely available via OAI PMH in Mark 21 format and Dublin Core to be used for research purposes as well as anything else. This is the access page for our national bibliography at the Search and Discovery interface to the catalog. As you perhaps can see, it is subdivided into subsets of books, serials, musical recordings, sheet music, Sami publications, and articles in Norwegian and Nordic publications. The parts that reside in legacy systems are the serials, articles, and older parts of the printed sheet music. We have long since acknowledged that maintenance of this legacy platform is no longer sustainable, but things take time in NLN, and there are still no firm decisions or plans how to handle this particular issue. Connecting bibliographical data to authorities is an important measure to maintain a certain degree of consistency and reliability of the metadata. So far, we have a fairly large authority file for agents, as well as an up-to-date GUI via WebGUI and a genre-formed thesaurus about to be published on our new Scosmos-based vocabulary service. A work authority file is in progress, partly through our participation in ShareVDE. Concerning our agent authorities, there is a human-readable search interface to them all, around 2 million authority records. This includes all agents referred to by the NLN holdings, as well as the holdings of the other 80 academic and special libraries sharing our catalog. Lately, authorities referred to from external metadata stores have also been included. As mentioned earlier, an API is offered as well as harvesting and download facilities. An increasing number of the authorities are also linked to VIAF and/or ISNI. I thought I would say a few words about our metadata production line also. In a period when cataloging staff seem to grow fewer and far between, we are trying desperately to streamline our processes. However, we are still a long distance from an optimal position. This is a visualization of the current situation for books in the National Bibliography. And it's also how we currently try to fulfill our obligations to supply free metadata for books in time to local libraries. I should point out that this is only a rather small part of the story. For example, newspaper, periodicals, music, etc. are handled elsewhere. The figure mainly shows how the external metadata provider interoperate with NLN and other libraries, and obvious improvement points that we plan to deal with. The process starts whenever the vendor receives information about the planned publication or receives the actual publication. Then they catalog it in their system according to our requirements and export the Mark 21 record to the OAI server. From there, any library may import it into the system via the provided protocols. And so, in fact, does NLN. At NLN, nothing more happens until the deposited material arrives, which for the physical material may take some time, as it might be subject to logistical issues. When the material is received, the record is completed and holdings are registered. There are several reasons why the above setup is not optimal, or at least will not be optimal in the future. We have not yet in place an efficient workflow for handling deposited books, which takes full advantage of the fact that most of the physical books will be accompanied or preceded perhaps by a printing file, PDF, and also core metadata. When the new workflow is in place, the role of the external vendor may need to change. Then cataloging may be done based solely on the PDF, manually, or even perhaps partly automatically by extracting metadata from the PDF, for instance, the title page. We have also experimented with machine learning for classification and subject indexing, but no serious development has been initiated yet. Another issue with the current setup is the interoperability with the search and lending service, the library search. Right now, metadata records, not only holdings, are harvested from individual libraries, relying on the import mechanism to discover duplicate records, which, as you all know, is not easy and leads to lots of noise. Finally, managing bibliographical data as linked data is starting to become feasible and useful, as indicated by international initiatives like ShareVDE, LD4P, and others. In light of the development in semantic technologies during recent years, NLN would like to be able to operate and serve linked data, possibly apply an entity-based data model as native metadata. A further step, sorry. A further step towards the goal of one book, one catalog entry will be to create a single authorized source for the metadata in Norway, a metadata well. Establishing such a service is perhaps the biggest task assigned to us through the National Library Strategy, although the work is to be shared with our system partner UNIT. The metadata well is still very much on the conceptualization and planning stage, and we are now about to issue a RFI. What we are thinking is that all metadata produced for the Norwegian National Bibliography will be included in the metadata well, and so will metadata contributed by other authorized contributors. Indeed, our vision is that eventually metadata from all Norwegian libraries will be included and managed in the metadata well. One way of thinking of it is as an authority file for bibliographical descriptions. This implies that no holding information is to be included there. Libraries can then obtain bibliographical descriptions for their local catalogs, either by just referring to it or by copying it to their own catalog, all the while retaining its globally unique identifier in their local data. In their catalog, they only need to add their local information. The metadata well itself will be accessible via open and standardized interfaces and formats. At least MARC 21 and linked data are to be served. With such a resource in place, library search can then be based on data in the metadata well and only needs to retrieve holdings information and circulation status from the local library catalogs. To sum up, our aim is for the metadata well to contain master data from all libraries and thereby unite the library sector in Norway in the field of metadata, and also hopefully better facilitate resource sharing. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oddrun Paulina. Yours is a very engaging work. More particularly interesting is the support the National Library of Norway gives to the other libraries of Norway. Thank you again, Oddrun Paulina Orean. The last speaker of the day is an expert librarian of the National Central Library of Florence. Before working here, he was a chief librarian at the University of Trento and at the University of Perugia, where he had been for 20 years. Now he is the head of the Italian National Bibliography and Agency, and is also in charge of the current cataloging office of the library. Since 2015, he has been a member of the Italian National Commission to keep updated the Italian cataloging rules, REICAT. The title of his presentation is The Italian National Bibliography Today. Please welcome Paolo Vosch Bellini. It's up to you, Paolo.
Yes. Can you see me? Yes?
Yes, yes, sure. Ciao.
Yes. So. Can I see me? Yes?
Yes, we see you. Are you going to share your slides?
Yes. It's okay? Is it okay?
No, non le vediamo, no.
Ah. Adesso?
No, neanche.
Come si fa a fare questa cosa?
Forse ti possono aiutare dallo staff, technical team, forse.
Condividi lo schermo, no? Non vedo quella... Ah.
Nessun problema, le condivido io. Paolo, mi dici quando devo girare la slide, va bene?
Aspetta, forse...
Ah, aspettiamo, vai.
Adesso?
No. Ah, forse ora. Sì, ora sì, Paolo.
Ok.
Bene.
Va bene. Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Con questo intervento vorrei dare un aggiornamento sulla bibliografia nazionale italiana, la BNI, e su come oggi si esplica il suo ruolo nell'ambito del controllo bibliografico. Non posso non iniziare chiarendo quale sia il contesto nel quale oggi viene elaborata la BNI. Le biblioteche statali italiane vivono da anni una crisi molto profonda dovuta a una contrazione di risorse senza precedenti. Questo vale anche per la Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze in tutte le sue articolazioni e anche quindi per la BNI. il personale, i catalogatori e le catalogatrici che fanno la BNI sono ormai ridotte a poche unità di personale. È vero che sono poche unità di personale, è vero, però sono anche persone estremamente competenti e specializzate, grazie a un lunghissimo tirocinio condotto a stretto contatto con chi ha fatto la storia della biblioteconomia nel nostro paese, illustri bibliotecari e bibliotecarie che peraltro, anche se in pensione, continuano a fornire la loro collaborazione preziosa in modo diretto o indiretto. Ora, il sapere di questo piccolo gruppo di persone che fa la BNI trae nuova linfa quotidianamente dal lavoro stesso, che le mette a confronto in modo sfidante con la realtà viva e sempre mutevole della produzione editoriale che sono chiamate a rappresentare a beneficio della comunità nazionale e internazionale degli utenti. Infatti, anche se, scusate, devo vedere. Ok. Allora, infatti, anche se la situazione del personale è innegabilmente drammatica e quasi incredibile, e penso che non trovi riscontro altrove, i compiti istituzionali della Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze, come ha ricordato anche il direttore Bellingeri proprio all'inizio di questo convegno, e che sono definiti dalla legge, non sono cambiati. Tra questi compiti vi è la costituzione e il mantenimento dell'archivio della produzione bibliografica nazionale e la sua rappresentazione attraverso adeguati strumenti catalografici e bibliografici, qualcosa che nessuno Stato rinuncia ad avere. Dovendo necessariamente stabilire delle priorità di azione, abbiamo deciso di privilegiare, di continuare a privilegiare, la produzione di dati di massimo livello qualitativo, perché siamo consapevoli, siamo convinti che sia questo, in funzione del controllo bibliografico, il miglior contributo che noi siamo in grado di dare. Quindi tempestività, copertura, autorevolezza, redazione di record di autorità a livello richiesto da una bibliografia nazionale, manutenzione degli archivi condivisi a livello nazionale e internazionale sono gli aspetti sui quali abbiamo deciso di concentrare i nostri sforzi. Parlo adesso della tempestività. La tempestività è l'aspetto al quale prestiamo maggiore attenzione o particolare attenzione, cioè la rapidità con cui i libri vengono catalogati, i libri che gli editori ci spediscono in virtù della legge sul deposito obbligatorio degli stampati. La rapidità della catalogazione determina in modo molto significativo la soddisfazione degli utenti ed è per questo che, secondo noi, deve avere priorità assoluta. La catalogazione presso la Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze e quindi anche presso la BNI viene fatta direttamente nella rete del Servizio Bibliotecario Nazionale, utilizzando il software SBN Web. Le schede che vengono create per il catalogo della Biblioteca Nazionale e per la BNI alimentano quindi anche il catalogo di SBN. Sono visibili immediatamente alle altre biblioteche della rete e nell'OPAC di SBN dopo un breve tempo. Nell'OPAC della Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze le schede elaborate per la BNI sono visibili entro 24 ore ed entro circa 10 giorni dal loro arrivo nei locali dove si svolge la catalogazione, i libri selezionati vengono catalogati, non ci sono arretrati. Affinché i libri descritti mostrino anche i contenuti semantici loro attribuiti, passa però altro tempo. C'è uno scarto. Questo ritardo adesso è pari ad alcuni mesi e stiamo lavorando a un progetto per risolvere questo problema che speriamo entro questo anno sarà superato. Vengo adesso alla copertura. La copertura è l'altro aspetto che ha un'importanza prioritaria per ogni bibliografia nazionale e ovviamente per gli utenti. Cioè, quanti sono i libri che vengono ogni anno inclusi nella bibliografia nazionale e ovviamente che vengono inclusi nella bibliografia in rapporto alla produzione editoriale italiana. Questa tabella di questa slide mostra qual è il numero di notizie bibliografiche prodotte per la BNI negli ultimi 10 anni. Come si vede, siamo intorno agli 11.000-12.000 record annui, segnalazioni annue. C'è un incremento, sebbene irregolare, della produzione. Abbiamo avuto un picco massimo di produttività nel 2018, quando sono state catalogate 15.503 notizie, naturalmente complete di soggetto e di URI. Ora la domanda è come valutare questa quantità rispetto alla produzione libraria italiana. Per questo possiamo riferirci ai dati forniti dall'Istituto Centrale di Statistica. Secondo l'istituto, l'Istat, sempre in relazione al 2018, le case editrici italiane hanno pubblicato 75.758 libri. Poi qui nella slide è specificato che cosa l'Istat intenda per libri. È questo quindi il numero di pubblicazioni al quale fare riferimento per valutare la produzione che abbiamo visto prima nel 2018 è stata di 15.500 schede. Però va detto che l'elenco delle pubblicazioni, che questo numero, diciamo così, va valutato attentamente perché la bibliografia nazionale italiana è una bibliografia selettiva e c'è un ampio numero di pubblicazioni che tradizionalmente non sono incluse nella BNI. Qui c'è la lista di tutte le tipologie di pubblicazioni che non sono incluse nella BNI. Naturalmente queste pubblicazioni vengono catalogate dalla Nazionale di Firenze, ma vengono catalogate a livello 51 per intendersi. Vengono catalogate per la Biblioteca Nazionale, ma non confluiscono le schede nella Bibliografia Nazionale Italiana. Oppure vengono trattate per insiemi cosiddetti gruppi. Quindi, come si vede da questo elenco, il materiale non incluso nella bibliografia nazionale per scelte di politica editoriale è molto numeroso. Quanti sono questi libri che corrispondono a questo elenco che abbiamo visto? Per saperlo bisogna nuovamente fare riferimento alle statistiche dell'Istat, che per ogni categoria, sempre Istat, dice anche quanti sono i libri corrispondenti. E in effetti si vede che si scende moltissimo. I libri, per esempio, per fare un solo esempio, i libri scolastici che non vengono inclusi nella BNI sono quasi 10.000. Quindi, eliminando tutte queste varie tipologie di pubblicazioni, si vede che quello che resta nel 2018 è questo numero qui, 37.940. Ma in realtà le pubblicazioni che vengono escluse utilizzando questa lista qui sono molte di più di quelle che abbiamo visto ora in queste liste dell'Istat. Cioè, in pratica, quello che voglio dire è che queste classificazioni, questi raggruppamenti non sono sovrapponibili, quelli, cioè i libri esclusi dalla BNI e queste categorie Istat, però abbiamo un'idea abbastanza valida di quali sono le dimensioni, diciamo, gli ordini di grandezza. Tutto ciò per dire che sicuramente eliminate tutte queste tipologie di materiali e le ristampe, i libri che restano da catalogare per la bibliografia nazionale sono effettivamente quelli che vengono catalogati. Cioè, sulla base della mia esperienza, della selezione dei libri e dell'analisi dei dati statistici sulla produzione editoriale italiana, credo che si possa affermare che la copertura della BNI è buona, è rappresentativa, naturalmente secondo questi criteri adottati storicamente, che sono fondamentalmente criteri tipologici e qualitativi. Vengo adesso al tema delle risorse umane, al quale chiaramente non posso fare almeno cenno. Per fare fronte alla cronica carenza di personale via via sempre più grave, negli ultimi anni siamo ricorsi al parziale affidamento della catalogazione a ditte esterne. È una soluzione che garantisce flessibilità, ma pone anche un'esigenza di controllo della qualità che ovviamente sussiste per tutti, ma per la BNI in misura maggiore, molto maggiore, sia perché è l'Agenzia Bibliografica Nazionale, sia perché i libri che vengono catalogati per la BNI confluiscono le schede in SBN, sono marcati, diciamo così, contrassegnati dal più alto livello di autorità e questi record non sono modificabili dalle altre biblioteche della rete. Quindi è necessario che siano il più possibile corretti. Affinché questi record possano essere portati a livello 51, i requisiti richiesti sono quelli che si vedono in questa slide, cioè devono essere presenti tutti i dati desumibili dalla pubblicazione e da fonti esterne, deve essere effettuato il controllo dei dati sui repertori bibliografici, per esempio le bibliografie nazionali dei vari paesi, i cataloghi delle grandi biblioteche, i dizionari biografici, gli authority files nazionali e internazionali, e questi dati devono essere integrati quando necessario, oppure creati. Inoltre deve essere presente il collegamento con tutti i legami previsti e applicabili, che peraltro oggi, come sappiamo, sono più numerosi di ieri. Per questo motivo il controllo sulla catalogazione viene effettuato a più riprese, sia su tutte quante le schede prodotte dai collaboratori interni e da quelli esterni, sia attraverso ampi riscontri sulle pubblicazioni per la catalogazione descrittiva e per la catalogazione semantica. È chiaro che queste verifiche richiedono molto tempo e competenza, ma sono indispensabili per garantire la qualità che a questo livello è richiesta. Poi vorrei dire che non è tanto un problema di errori, che non sono molti peraltro, quanto di allineamento di tutto lo staff nell'applicazione delle regole di catalogazione, nelle modalità di applicazione delle regole di catalogazione. Questa è la cosa che è veramente difficile da ottenere. Questa slide dà un'idea di quante sono le richieste di correzione che pervengono in un anno alla Bibliografia Nazionale Italiana. Si vede che nel 2019 sono pervenute 289 richieste di proposte di correzione, che chiaramente è un numero irrisorio rispetto alla quantità di record che sono nel catalogo della Biblioteca Nazionale. Vengo adesso ai rapporti con SBN e alla cooperazione bibliotecaria e anche forse più al focus di questo convegno. La collaborazione con SBN è un fatto di enorme e positivo rilievo sia per la Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze stessa, sia per le altre biblioteche della rete. C'è un mutuo vantaggio. Dato che la catalogazione fatta alla Nazionale di Firenze avviene esclusivamente il libro alla mano e per quanto riguarda la BNI al massimo livello di autorità previsto da SBN, è evidente come la Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze svolga un enorme lavoro di manutenzione del catalogo del Servizio Bibliotecario Nazionale attraverso la catalogazione ex novo e la revisione dei record elaborati dalle altre biblioteche e gli interventi su tutte le componenti del reticolo che dà luogo al record stesso. Se la BNI elabora 14.000 record annui, pubblica 14.000 schede annue, ciò significa che tutto l'insieme dei punti di accesso, degli elementi descrittivi, semantici e di autorità di queste 14.000 notizie è creato o passato al vaglio da parte di un gruppo di catalogatori estremamente esperti. Si tratta quindi di un'enorme quantità di metadati descrittivi e di decine di migliaia di voci di autorità portate al livello massimo e che l'ICU, per esempio, può trasmettere al via. È un lavoro che nessun altro fa in Italia e credo nemmeno posso fare, perché molti dei riscontri che sono necessari fare, che è necessario fare nella catalogazione per la BNI, richiedono controlli diretti sulle pubblicazioni pregresse e quindi richiedono che sia posseduto tutto quanto è stato pubblicato in Italia. E questo naturalmente sono solo le biblioteche nazionali di Firenze e Roma ad averlo. Una delle decisioni che sono state prese negli ultimi anni è stato di eliminare progressivamente ogni difformità di applicazione delle regole e di usi catalografici fra BNI e ICO, per ridurre al minimo la necessità di intervenire sulle schede catturate e soprattutto anche in considerazione del valore positivo che in un catalogo partecipato ha l'uniformità delle scelte. E anche per questo siamo entrati, sebbene ci costi molto, data l'esiguità del nostro personale, in tutti i gruppi di lavoro che l'ICO ha creato recentemente. Ma quali sono gli interventi sulle schede catturate da SBN per la BNI? Bene, devo dire che gli interventi sono molti e di grande qualità. Mi limito a segnalare i più significativi. Prima di tutto la redazione o l'aggiornamento al massimo livello della scheda di autorità dei nomi personali per tutte le responsabilità individuate relativamente ai libri catalogati. Ai record di autorità viene aggiunto, quando esistente, il codice ISNI, esaminando anche il caso di eventuali duplicazioni, che purtroppo non sono infrequenti. Un capitolo molto rilevante è quello del legame al titolo dell'opera, e anche questa è una novità per la BNI e per la Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze, perché fino a tempi molto recenti il titolo dell'opera, il titolo uniforme, veniva creato o legato solo per i libri tradotti o per le opere antiche. Adesso invece, in conformità sempre a quanto stabilito dall'ICO, dal Ministero e da quanto previsto da FRBR, questo legame viene creato per tutti i libri e questo naturalmente ha comportato un notevole aggravio di lavoro e un allungamento dei tempi di catalogazione, però anche un notevole innalzamento della qualità del catalogo. Poi voglio ricordare la creazione del legame a ente. Anche questo sembra una minuzia, ma in realtà non lo è. In pratica viene creato il collegamento a un ente responsabile, che ha una qualche responsabilità relativamente alla pubblicazione, se il libro è anonimo o privo di responsabilità principale, qualora l'indicazione dell'ente sia presente sul frontespizio, in copertina o in altra posizione privilegiata. Questo è uno degli interventi più frequenti che si fanno sulle schede catturate da SBN, perché in realtà questo legame non c'è praticamente mai. Così come non c'è mai anche il legame a ente per collane con titolo generico pubblicate appunto da un ente, e ovviamente anche questo lo creiamo. Purtroppo non posso fare a meno di notare che sono sempre più frequenti in SBN i casi di record privi di qualunque elemento di accesso controllato, anche quando è chiarissimo che vi sono delle responsabilità principali o secondarie. C'è un certo decadimento. Allora io credo che anche questo elenco molto parziale, che rappresenta solo una piccola parte degli interventi che vengono fatti, mostri come gli interventi effettuati in funzione della BNI in SBN siano quantitativamente moltissimi, ma anche di grande qualità, e di come comportino un aumento significativo della qualità complessiva del catalogo SBN e un notevole potenziamento delle possibilità di ricerca. Non ho tempo per parlare come avrei voluto dei problemi sorti a causa della pandemia, ma non voglio almeno omettere di dire che la catalogazione in questo ultimo anno non si è mai fermata, grazie alla disponibilità del personale, soprattutto a farsi carico del problema del trasporto dei libri dalla biblioteca a casa e viceversa, che è stata la questione più complessa, più difficile da risolvere, e anche grazie alla disponibilità del personale informatico. Vengo al mio avvio a concludere. Naturalmente non mancano, data la situazione con la quale che ho illustrato iniziando a parlare, non mancano criticità e soprattutto obiettivi che dovremmo porci avendo le risorse umane necessarie per raggiungerli. Fra questi segnalo prima di tutto la necessità di ottimizzare la fruibilità del prodotto BNI che è troppo nascosto all'interno del sito della Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze ed è anche molto complicato da consultare. Un altro obiettivo è rendere disponibile la BNI anche in formato RDF, oltre ai formati XML e Unimark attuali. È assolutamente prioritario in quanto prerequisito per attivare ulteriori progetti. Dovremo anche lavorare per dare più spazio alle serie separate della BNI, oltre a quella delle monografie, quindi i periodici, la musica stampa e le tesi di dottorato, per le quali tuttavia c'è un progetto, è già partito un progetto per almeno l'harvesting dai repositories degli Atenei che le rende visibili nell'OPAC della biblioteca. Un altro obiettivo da raggiungere al più presto, come ho detto, è aumentare la celerità con la quale anche le informazioni di tipo semantico sono messe a disposizione insieme alla descrizione dei libri, che è quasi immediata. Ora io credo che risulti chiaro da quanto ho detto che adottando varie misure di carattere organizzativo e procedurale, un gruppo di persone molto ridotto e sempre più esiguo, ma competente, esperto e motivato, ha potuto contrastare una situazione decisamente avversa, aumentando della bibliografia nazionale italiana il grado di completezza, la tempestività e l'autorevolezza, a livello che l'ha sempre contraddistinta e secondo standard adeguati rispetto a quanto previsto dal Servizio Bibliotecario Nazionale. Anche nella constatazione ovvia che i dati, per essere condivisi, devono innanzitutto essere creati. Non ci nascondiamo che la situazione per la bibliografia nazionale italiana è davvero ormai critica e quello che è stato possibile fare finora non lo sarà ancora per molto, anzi. Sta venendo a mancare la massa critica stessa necessaria affinché le idee e gli stimoli possano trasformarsi in progetti concreti. Inoltre la situazione è difficilissima per tutti, non solo per noi della Bibliografia Nazionale o della Biblioteca Nazionale, ma anche per gli altri settori, anche per gli altri partner con cui noi dobbiamo collaborare a partire dal Ministero stesso. Il rischio è che vada disperso un enorme e unico patrimonio fatto di conoscenze, di esperienza, di competenza, eredità di generazioni di bibliotecari e di bibliotecarie, senza che tutto ciò possa essere trasmesso a chi seguirà e senza poter implementare tutte quelle collaborazioni che, come abbiamo visto durante questo bellissimo convegno, sarebbe assolutamente necessario mettere in atto. Sarebbe un danno irreparabile per il mondo delle biblioteche, per la cultura e per il nostro paese. Grazie a tutti.
Grazie molte, Paolo. Thank you, Paolo, for telling us about the Italian National Bibliography and its challenges. We wish you success in carrying out such an important work. C'è una domanda, ti chiedo la cortesia di rispondere molto brevemente. Cosa pensa della possibilità di cooperare con altri soggetti, innanzitutto con gli editori, per la condivisione dei dati, di autorità, dati descrittivi, metadati in genere? Pensa sia possibile per la BNI? I translate the question. What do you think about the possibility of cooperating with other actors, publishers on shared data, authorities, metadata, descriptive data? Do you think it will be possible for BNE? I'm sorry to ask you to answer briefly.
I'm going to answer in Italian too. Mi piace parlerò in italiano. Dunque, Allora, certamente, bisogna vedere un po' di cosa si parla, no? Abbiamo visto durante questo convegno delle interessantissime relazioni, anche oggi. Chiaramente la condivisione dei dati sugli autori è la cosa che viene subito in mente, e quello di cui si è parlato di più anche durante questo convegno. E questo sarebbe un grande aiuto, perché la disambiguazione degli autori, specialmente oggi che il numero degli omonimi aumenta sempre di più, sarebbe veramente un aiuto prezioso. È qualcosa che prende molto tempo, quindi sarebbe senz'altro molto utile. Per altre cose magari penso che ci vorrà più tempo, o comunque che sarà molto difficile, perché anche questo è stato detto durante il convegno, molto autorevolmente. I metadati descrittivi che vengono elaborati dagli editori in realtà sono ben diversi da quelli che creiamo noi in biblioteca. Ed è ovvio che sia così, perché una cosa che forse non viene detta abbastanza spesso, che è che difficilmente i dati sono creati a prescindere da una finalità precisa, a parte dati estremamente basici, quindi la data di nascita, il luogo di nascita. Altri dati poi vengono naturalmente creati con una qualche finalità, ed è difficile che la finalità con cui un attore crea dei dati sia la stessa con cui le biblioteche poi utilizzano o che le biblioteche riutilizzano per creare, per esempio, una stessa attività. Ecco. Questo, quindi penso che sia forse più facile, perché la mission anche è più simile, collaborare con Wikidata. Ecco, questo penso, almeno allo stato attuale delle cose.
Grazie molte.
Ecco.
Grazie molte Paolo. Arrivederci. Now we are going to have the closing remarks and conclusions by 3 central members of the organizing committee of the conference. I'm talking about Mauro Guerrini, University of Florence, Chair of the Conference, Giovanni Bergamin, Italian Library Association, Co-Chair of the Conference, Laura Manzoni, University of Florence. Giovanni Bergamin is going to speak for all of them. Please welcome Giovanni.
I'm trying to share my screen. I think it's okay.
Okay, see, yes.
Okay. So, closing remarks. In this conference, we have seen a radical change in the ways UBC vision is carried out in a digital ecosystem. The traditional models was mainly based on National Bibliographic agencies where the UBC goal was expected as a sum of the national commitments. In the digital environment, bibliographic control is widespread among a variety of nodes, and every node can share, enhance, and reuse bibliographic information. Digital ecosystem has no, in principle, national borders, and every node can contribute directly to UBC. As you know, digital ecosystem is commonly referred to as the web. Let us take a journey through some nodes relevant for the UBC in the digital ecosystem. Publishers are, of course, the first node. Published resources are created together with their metadata, and among metadata, identifiers play a relevant role in bibliographic control. A growing part of resources are now published following the open access model, and metadata are created from the initial stage to support access and reuse. Cultural industry relies on bibliographic metadata to fulfill specific goals. cultural industry, of course, could be defined as large-scale production and distribution of cultural products and services. Libraries are the second node. Libraries are a fundamental UBC node. For over 50 years, they have been aware of digital transformation. Digital transformation is the adoption of digital technology to transform services, not only through replacing non-digital or manual processes with digital ones, but as a way to create and promote new kind of services. As we know, MARC was created in the 60s. Since then, metadata, both for digital and non-digital resources, are in digital form. In recent years, libraries have been involved in transition initiative in order to find a transition path for MARC. The aim of the transition path is to reap the benefits of newer technology while preserving a robust data exchange. The data exchange supporting reuse, resource sharing. Of course, the newer technologies are grounded on the semantic web vision and linked data technology. Just to remember, the collection of interrelated data sets on the web can also be referred to as linked data. At the end of the transition path, also the bibliographic data sets can take part of this collection of interrelated data sets. However, this transition is far from being an easy path. We have to face several challenges, including there is no a unique starting point, that is MARC. There are many implementations of MARC. MARC 21 and UniMARC are the most widespread MARC implementation, but there are many others. Second challenge, there is no single point of arrival. Of course, today BibFrame is a fundamental reference ontology, especially for library data in MARC 21 format. But the discussion on metadata standard, data models, and ontologies for bibliographic data is still ongoing. Third challenge, the transition path has to take into account that the problems of integration between different cultural and linguistic traditions still persist. It would be important that the ontologies at the arrival point could accommodate and reconcile different ways to say the same thing. Search engine could be the third node. Today, another node of bibliographic control could be represented by the ubiquitous search engines. De facto, they are also used as a tool to search bibliographic information, and the creators of bibliographic metadata can use standards such as schema.org to improve representation and search of bibliographic data on the web. It's worth noting that the schema.org is compliant with semantic web ontologies. Excuse me, with semantic web technologies. In this context, search engines could be considered as machine reading catalogs. Artificial intelligence in libraries could represent a fourth node. Speaking of machines and catalogs, we have to note that since 2012, MARC 21 provides the field 883 named metadata provenance to allow recording metadata fully or partially machine generated. As we know, thanks to technology based mainly on artificial intelligence, machines are in position to generate or suggest metadata relevant for access. This is probably the most significant change in the relationship between machine and catalogs, machine writing catalogs. Last node of this journey could be represented by Wikidata Wikibase. Also, Wikidata is of rising importance in bibliographic control. There are a number of initiatives in library field that are using Wikidata or Wikibase. IFLA, at the end of 2019, has created a working group to explore the integration of Wikidata and Wikibase with the library systems and alignment of Wikidata ontology with library metadata formats such as BibFrame, RDA, and MARC. Wikidata can also be seen as a success story of reuse and the enhancement of the metadata produced by libraries in the field of authority control, especially in collecting and relating clustering identifiers. Wikibase has been defined as a promising technical infrastructure to store, edit, and exchange bibliographic data. Also, Wikidata and Wikibase are based on semantic web vision and linked data technologies. At the end of this journey, it is important to stress the interconnection between bibliographic control and long-term digital preservation. UBC is of no use if the reference digital resources were lost. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, but in the digital ecosystem, giants may turn quickly into clay giants. For instance, today a substantial part of scientific research is digitally published, and it is also based on previous digital published research. Digital resources are constantly threatened mainly by the effect of technological obsolescence. If we lose the digital resources of the past, also the existing digital resources will lose their value. As we know, the objective of the legal deposit legislation is to ensure in the long term universal and equitable access to information, recorded both in digital and in traditional form. National libraries have in most countries this legal mandate, which usually would serve as a basis for attaining national bibliographic control. National libraries are also aware that the mass of information to manage is huge and constantly growing. For this reason, both selection and cooperation must be the direction to follow. The vision of UBC still remains valid, even if bibliographic control is now based on multiple nodes and on the cooperation between them. In general, within this vision, national bibliographic agencies are redefining their role. Core activities are still the same, namely authority control, quality control, commitment on standardization, and on building and maintenance of vocabularies and thesauri. These activities are now performed directly on the digital ecosystem. They can impact not only in digital catalogs, but also in other cultural domains and at the end in everyday life. Libraries do not have the monopoly of bibliographic control, but thanks to their mission, they can ensure trustworthy information organization. Cultural resources in digital or analog form are social objects. Through cultural resources, we understand and interact with the world. Metadata or cultural resources in the digital ecosystem are key infrastructure that make possible an efficient and equitable access to fundamental social objects. For these reasons, bibliographic control has to deal with the key contribution made by libraries to the economic, social, health, and environmental sustainability of our communities. Grazie.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your conclusions, Giovanni. Thank you also to Mauro and Laura. And now, on behalf of our organizing committee, the speakers, and the secretariat, I'd like to thank everyone for your participation. I'm sure that the conference will have an important sequel, so we hope to meet you again soon. Best regards to all of you, and stay well. Please don't go away now, because we would like to take the final photo of the conference. I ask all the panelists in Zoom to turn on their cameras for the final photo. Thank you. Can you please turn on your cameras? Your camera for a final photo.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Best wishes. Stay well. Bye.
La Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze ha sede in un edificio inaugurato nel 1935, ma la sua origine risale al 1714, quando Antonio Magliabechi donò la sua libreria privata alla cittadinanza. Unita alla Biblioteca Palatina nel 1861, nel 1885 assume la qualifica di Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale. Possiede oltre 6 milioni di volumi, 3 milioni di opuscoli, 430.000 titoli seriali, 25.000 manoscritti e quasi 1 milione di autografi, e inoltre ricca di raccolte di musica stampa e di risorse grafiche. Grazie al deposito legale, esercita il controllo bibliografico sulle pubblicazioni italiane, realizza la bibliografia nazionale italiana, cura gli strumenti impiegati nell'indicizzazione del soggetto, si occupa di risorse digitali e della loro conservazione nel lungo periodo. Con la Biblioteca Nazionale di Roma è uno dei principali poli del Servizio Bibliotecario Nazionale.
The library at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, enhances the research of an international community of about 1,500 members between PhD researchers, postdoctoral fellows, and professors in the social sciences. To this day, its collections count more than 500,000 books, 500,000 e-books, 365 databases, 107,000 e-journals. The EUI Research Repository, Cadmus, collects, preserves, and provides access to the EUI research outputs, including datasets, according to the EUI Open Access Policy. As an OCLC member, the EUI Library contributes with its cataloguing records to WorldCat to maintain its holdings and to make its collections visible.
The Central Institute for the Union Catalog, based in Rome, coordinates national activities dedicated to cultural heritage through solid technology and a team of professionals powering databases and services to the benefit of the whole library community.
Qui all'ICCU lavoriamo ogni giorno con passione per la valorizzazione del patrimonio, ispirandoci al futuro.
How do you define success? Is it improved educational outcomes? contributing valuable resources that support student learning and research? How about return on investment? Understanding student and faculty needs and exceeding expectations? Or what about innovation? Providing experiences that enhance learning, but also inspire. At OCLC, our sole focus is helping you on your journey to success. That's it. And WorldShare Management Services is designed to empower your goals. Workflows are up to 4 times faster, creating bandwidth for your team to increase impact where it matters. Actionable analytics support your vision for a culture of academic achievement. And powerful group functionality encourages active collaboration. Your users are always center stage, with an intuitive experience that lets staff, students, and researchers focus on doing amazing things. You define your library's journey to success. WorldShare Management Services helps you get there.